We're going to go back to growth and look at geometrical growth models for computational anatomy by Irene Kaltenmark.
Thank you. So this, do you hear me? Yeah. So this is mainly the work of my PhD. And I invite you to a journey in a non-deformorphic world to model growth phenomena. So first of all, I don't see. Okay, so we will have an introductory talk on shape registration, just to have the context, and I will seize the occasion to also work of some talk of some work I've been doing with Nicolas Charon and Benjamin Charlier to compare current and varifold data terms. But then I will finally present you a new model to generate a growth scenario. In this second part, we'll only see how to use biological prior to generate individual scenario. And the third part will address the problem to recover the scenario given some input longitudinal data. And we'll have some experiment to illustrate the model. So I'm currently working in a neuroscience institute, so it gives me a great window on work on medical imaging. And so I thought that I would introduce this talk with this work on functional voice activity. So you have here on the left individual map of activation in the brain when the human hears a human voice. And to analyze this type of data, they have to register all these individual maps on an atlas. And we see here that shape registration, as we talked earlier, is not only about geometrical registration, but really functional registration. Your registration is a key element to analyze your data, and if your registration induces a shift on this area that detects voice in some individual, it will lead to an error in your data. And for example, in this study, they use a registration method called hip-hop, where they use the bottom of the sulcal fold in the brain to improve the registration. Why? Because mainly the method commonly used in neuroscience is sadly not LDDMM, but it's a method based on a curvature, and so it performs well on the top of the gyri and not so well in the bottom of the sulcal folds, which are more flat. And they have this assumption that the bottom of this fold have a high biological consistence inter-individual. So they use this prior on biological homology between shape to improve the registration. If now we consider growth, if I will start with the bone, for example, the growth, the evolution of a bone consists, there's two areas at the ends of the bone called epiphyseal plates, where we have creation of new material. And globally, once the material is created, you have a nullification process, which means that the material here becomes harder and harder from the center toward these plates. And so when you look at the biological homology between 2 points, this point here have its homologue that should be in this area and not close to the epiphyseal plate. You have progressively adjunction of new material at the end of the bones. So if you do your classic registration with a diffeomorphic matching, you see that you will have an obvious issue. In plant growth, we have two examples of two types of growth. Like on the first row, so actually I pitched those drawing of time-lapse video that I found on YouTube. And for the first group, which is ox leaf, you see that the evolution is similar to global scaling. And you have this geometrical feature that are the principal vein and secondary vein, and you see that their number remains stable. On the second row, you see that you still have a global change of size induced by a scaling, but at the bottom of the leaf, and you clearly see it in the video, you have creation of new material, and it's highlighted by the emergence of new veins and new indentation on the boundary of the leaf. And here there's the definition of homology is quite tricky because you're tempted to use the vein to define the homology, but actually in reality you have creation of new material at the bottom of the leaf, and it's after a certain time that you have the emergence of your vein. But the material is here, it's just its role change, like the tissue becomes more complex, and the vein, it's just the vascularization of the leaf is taking form. But so the material is already created, and eventually its function change. But for us, the homology is the fact that we can really track a point. We can. It would be easier in this way. We cannot track backwards the point at the bottom of the leaf till the first one. So we have creation of new coordinates that we want to integrate in our shape registration method. So to summarize, we can distinguish at the macroscopic scale two types of growth. Type 1 is a growth homogeneously distributed, and the type 2 is a growth that involves new material on specific area, usually on the boundary of the organism. And I would call this creation of new material the creation of new Darcian coordinates. And we have many examples like plant growth, crystal growth, bones, horns, mollusk shell, tendon cartilage, and tooth enamel. A very complex problem is that the second leaf grows for both the type 1 and the type 2 process. We have the deformation process and the creation process. And the nonlinear combination of these two processes is a challenging problem. So in this talk and for my application, I will focus on the case study of the horns which are rigid shape. So we will only have a creation process and a rigid deformation process. And so, as we do not want to apply the classic diffeomorphism, and we want to encode the creation of new material here again at the bottom of the shape, we will use inner partial matching. But before that, let me recall very quickly the context. So as we've seen before, I will just introduce the notation. We have a group of deformation acting on a shape space, and usually this group is built by a space of vector field V, and actually, in practice, we only need to know the infinitesimal action of this vector field on our shapes. And so I will denote xi the infinitesimal action of vector field on an embedded shape in a given ambient space. So then, from shape space to inexact matching, we have a source that we want to match with a target, and we actually don't want the exact target, but something, a shape close to it. And the question is, how do we model a shape? And for this current and varifold, answer both to how to deal with parametrization invariance, and provide a metric to quantify what I denote the ball around the target. So metric that locally quantify the neighborhood of my target. And so the inexact matching problem consists to minimize an energy that penalize the deformation and the so here we have the varifold of the current that represents the deformated source, and the varifold or current that represents our target. And with the introduction of Robertson kernel of Hilbert space, we can build a Hilbert space of currents and varifolds, and so we have their associated metric. So I won't give you the explicit formula for currents and varifolds, but instead I will present you a few examples to compare those. So here we have the matching of a horse on a camel, and we see with currents classical problem of cancel effect. For the current metric, here the head of the horse has been reduced to this looping curve, and for the current metric, this part of the curve has a nullness because of the cancelling effect. Here again, you see that you have two curves. You have two curves with opposite directions, so they cancel each other, and you see that your final shape in blue just ignored this separation of the two legs of the camel. For the unoriented varifold, you obtain a better result, but you still see that it's too expensive in this area to do the matching because you don't take into account the orientation of the curve, and you can guess that this blue curve is both attracted by this side or this side and falls in a local minima. Or it's too expensive to do the deformation and create this part of the shape. And you see that for oriented varifold, the result is pretty satisfying. So here I illustrate the robustness of currents to noise. You see that when we have a smooth source that we want to match on a noisy target, we have main difficulties with varifold because the mass of this noisy curve is highly larger than the mass of the smooth curve. However, if you take a noisy target, the mass corresponds, and you're able to do your matching. So we have basically the same results for currents or varifolds in this case. The last slide, this slide illustrates the large type of data that we can handle with varifolds. On the first column, we use unoriented varifolds because you can guess that it would be very hard to define a consistent orientation on all the segments. And on this second example, so as always, the target is the red shape and the source is the blue shape. We're able to manage both a surface and a fiber as long as we have shape that can be described as a set of points embedded in the ambient space and with a minimum of regularity. And the last fun example that I called in painting with oriented varifold. So we are matching an ellipsoid on a dolphin. So you have here the result of the classic experiments. But on the second column and the last column, we deleted 70% of the triangle, so we keep only 30. And on this last column, we kept only 5% of the triangle. So if you do the matching, it won't work because the position information and the tangential information is pretty well preserved by this cloud of triangle. What's missing is the mass information. So we change the mass information for each triangle in the represent varifold. But as we remove uniformly the triangle, you see it works pretty well. And even if you don't have the information, it's quite robust.
Did you scale the mass of the target?
Did I?
The mass of the target varifold.
Yes, I changed the mass of the target.
So you assume you knew the surface area of the whole dolphin?
No, that's what I said. So on this experiment, we knew it, so it's the optimal mass, but it's quite robust. Like 10% plus or minus 5–10%. And otherwise, you can just optimize with visual validation. Okay, let's go back to growth. When we want to consider growth process of type 2, we'd like to introduce a new coordinate during the deformation of the shape. And you see here with the grids that if the growth process is regular enough, we still have a structure that explains us where are the new coordinates about to appear. And we will use the structure to anticipate the creation of this new coordinate. The central hypothesis to do that is to assume that a population of related shape will share this common growth pattern. And so the last thing is that we will use this coordinate to delimit the image of the partial mapping that we want. So here you see that you want a partial mapping of the small horn on this one, and it's defined by the coordinates. So how to define this biological coordinate system? It's some kind of trivial scenario, so the flow acting on it is just the identity, and it explains you what will be the growth process of the shape. So here you have a cylinder that is extending from the bottom, and we have at each time creation of new circle at the bottom of the cylinder. And if we think of the minimal parameters, we have the union of so these shapes are actually included in each other. So the set of all the coordinates would be denoted x, and would be the union of what I will call the active coordinate at time t. This is the active coordinate at time t3. And we will have a birth tag that will actually delimit the level set of this birth tag will exactly tell us which are the coordinate actives at time t. Then, if we want to generate an individual scenario from this biological coordinate system, we just have to define a sequence of mapping from each subset of active coordinates to the ambient space. And you have here two examples, a cylinder, and we'll do an exception for the horn. You see that the first cylinder will be reduced to a point, but otherwise we have a diffeomorphic mapping between the set of active coordinates and the shape. So we have here our biological coordinate system, which describes the growth process of the population. Here we have our individual. The mapping between the coordinate system and the ambient space. And we have a flow that can also describe by partial mappings the evolution of the shape. So to exhibit the minimal parameters, we actually could just use the flow on the ambient space, and we need one global mapping from the whole coordinate space to the ambient space. And with the horn, what do we know about the new coordinates? They all appear at the bottom of the horn, which represent the head of the animal. So since we have this constraint on the birthplace of each new coordinate, we defined a mapping that tells us where is exactly created this coordinate. And since we do not want to affect the place of this coordinate before it's activated, any flow on the ambient space will only displace the point of the shape that corresponds to active coordinates. It defines a new infinitesimal action of the vector of a vector field V, which we have this filter defined by the birth tag that really explicits the active coordinates at a given time. So just on an example for the horn, you have here the real shape, biological shape that you want to model, and you have here the anticipation of the coordinates. So at the beginning, you have a flat disk that corresponds to the boundary of the head, and progressively, you have your horn growing. So from the center, since the blue coordinates are the first one to be created, till the end of your disk. And so the vector field, the flow on the ambient space, progressively carries on all the coordinates. So the parameters of the models are actually quite simple. You have at the population level the coordinate space and the birth tag, and at the individual level you have the birthplace function or the initial position and flow on the ambient space. So let's see a few examples. So here it's only an example in one dimension, I mean a curve. So here you see that all the points appear at the same position here. You have exactly the same setting with a new deformation. Here you see that all the points appear on this horizontal line. The same setting with another deformation. So progressively, the flow is carrying more and more points. Here you have 2 points that are created at each time. Same setting with another deformation. And a last example with the same setting, but another flow on the ambient space. So you maybe noticed that the regularity of your shape is not preserved by the action of a vector field. And so that will be an important point to study. We have here that the spatial regularity of the shape depends on the time regularity of the vector field. At each time you have a jump here, which this was the example with vertical translation, you have spatial irregularity, singularity on your shape. So just an overview of the theoretical framework for this generative model. So we have choose here specific infinitesimal actions, but we developed a more general model. We have so a space of mapping, and we do not have any more canonical choice because of the irregularity here, the spatial irregularity given by this indicator function. So we have a spanner space of mapping, the time-dependent infinitesimal action. So the infinitesimal action depends on the time. You have your group of deformation, the space of vector field, which model the tangent space at the identity, and psi qt gives you the action of vt on your shape. And we prove the existence and uniqueness for any flow, any initial position. And we studied the first order variation to address the matching problem. Okay. So what is the matching problem? You consider a final shape of an individual scenario. This is your input data. You assume that you can compute a good estimate of the initial position or the birthplace position of all your coordinates. And you have this major assumption on your growth pattern for this individual. And you want to retrieve the evolution of your individual. So it's pretty much the same setting as the LDDMM. The only difference is that your infinitesimal action depends on the time. But you retrieve your momentum defined by the differential of the data attachment term. It's a linear equation. The momentum map that tells you that gives you a mapping from the shapes, the space of the shape, the space of the momentum, and that depends on the time towards the dual of the space of vector field. And since V is a Hilbert space, you retrieve that your optimal vector is given by this momentum map. You can also write the Hamiltonian framework, and the only difference here is that this reduced Hamiltonian also depends on the time. So it implies some complication to control it over time, and it also says that you do not have any more conservation of your energy. So just to understand it on an example. So basic recall, how works the momentum map. You have control points given with position and vector. You apply the kernel of your space of vector field V, and the momentum map is just doing the sum of all the contribution of the control points, and it gives you a deformation. So when you look at the horn, the momentum map will just only consider the contribution of the active coordinates. And so the optimal vector field will be only built with the contribution of this rate, point, and momentum, while the other one are not displaced before the activation. So all the points in this area stay static. So when you look at the trajectory of the Hamiltonian, if actually you had no new coordinates, you would retrieve the classic LDDMM framework, and your Hamiltonian would be constant. Instead, here, at each time you have new coordinates that appear, they will slightly deviate your trajectory with the contribution of these new points. And when you look at this new point, they haven't moved since the beginning. So you can actually control them with the initial position, which is this flat disk, and the initial momentum. And this is how we control the global trajectory of the Hamiltonian. Everything is controlled by the initial variable. And here you have example of vector field, and I will just do a remark here, as we discussed with Jean earlier, do not use the Gaussian kernel, but use a kernel with heavy tail, and this holds also for varifold and a current to have a larger visibility at large scale. And also, but in my application, I will actually use rotation and translation, and I just give you here for translation the optimal vector field is just given by the sum of all the momentum. The theoretical issues. Well, the first one, as we discussed, the shape is not regular if we only consider square integrable time-dependent vector field. So we had to extend the definition using the density of a continuous vector field in L2. And actually, when the vector field is continuous, we have different. The shape here is C1 if the initial position is C1. So we proved the existence of global minimizer and their continuity in the current setup. And an unexpected thing is that we couldn't prove it, and we exhibit a counterexample with a varifold. And this was due to the fact that if you swap the sign, for example, of V here, you realize that you're able to create mass in a small area, which wouldn't be the case for currents since you have the cancellation effect. And let's finish with some example. So I recall that the input is the coordinate system giving the growth pattern, the final shape, or eventually some intermediate times, and we want to retrieve the complete evolution and eventually check the norm of the deformation to quantify the quality of the foliation here given by the gradient color that tells us if the growth has been accelerated or decreased with respect to our targets. And the final remark is that this complete scenario is modeled by just the initial shape, which is a flat disk, and the initial momentum. Everything is on code in these two variables. So the first time we tried to apply the model, we had some issue, and we realized that our geodesics were not adapted. So we changed. So we went from RKHS vector field to rotation and translation, and we also play with the cost functions to adapt the penalization. So we compare here the method, even if I didn't present you, but you can see here on each row you have both the target and the solution, and we use this explicit intermediate times. And you can see that the shape correspondence is good, but also the foliation given by the gradient color corresponds. So we have the evolution, the natural evolutions have been retrieved by the model. So as I said, we have the initial momentum and the initial position that completely describe our scenarios. The second experience we did, we generated a target with a decrease of the growth in the middle of the time interval. And we looked at the norm of the deformation, and you can see that we pretty well retrieve the rate of growth in the middle of the interval, I mean the decrease of the speed and the increase at the end. And this is really a flexibility of this model. At each time you integrate, you have new coordinates created. It changes the vector field, and you can the model can play on the norm of the vector field, which was not possible with the LDDMM framework. The last example, we tried the most long and curvated horn that we could. So you have here with that intermediate times, and you see that the only missing information is one axis of the rotation, but is still able to retrieve pretty well the mass and the distribution of the curvature, let's say. And the final result is pretty satisfying, and when you integrate intermediate times, you are very happy when you see that. This is view of the final shape, a different view for the first experiment with that intermediate times and with intermediate times. And I would just like to emphasize that we start from the flat disk in this red area and we generate this complete complex shape. And just to show you that we have a complete scenario, here is the result. So from the flat disk, we generate that. And that's all.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Any questions for Irene? Yeah, I have one question. If you go back, you have the active momenta that are, and then the non-active momenta are all the ones still that are on the flat disk.
Yes?
But the velocity field gets interpolated via the Gaussian kernel everywhere.
Yes, but the velocity field don't act on inactivate.
Oh, they don't act
because of the indicator on the infinitesimal action.
Ah, okay, okay. So that's you kind of bang them down to zero.
Here it is.
Okay, okay. So you force them to stay put at the base point.
You can see as you have your ambient space, which will be the blackboard, and the flow acting on the blackboard, and your shape is progressively embedded in the board and carried out.
Right.
That's another. I don't know if it's more clear.
Yeah. So the inactive momenta don't get transported by the flow. They get fixed.
That's what allows you to, for example, when you had all the points, I show you a curve where everyone is created here. This is what allows you to separate active from inactive. All the coordinates appears here, and they're progressively displaced.
And that's kind of why you lose the
conservation.
Yeah, and that's why you lose the. And that's why you end up losing the differentiability as well. Because they're not flowing with the thing, you kind of force them to detach from the flow. Is that one way to think about it?
So
your regularity in time, you need more regularity.
The regularity in time.
Because of that, this kind of
disconnect. Because when you have a irregular flow, and you're shaking your hand like this, it doesn't affect your hand. But if you have something that is progressively embedded in the ambient space, it is sensitive.
It is not moving with the hand.
Yeah.
Any other question? All right. Thank you very much, Irene.